Hello. Turn that up. I don't even know how. Welcome, everyone, to this beautiful space. Thank you so much for being here. It means more to my family and I than you can ever know to have you all here. It's truly amazing to see so many people gather together to celebrate the life of my father. Thank you. As you all know, the loss of Steve was as unexpected as it was tragic. For my mother, Lorraine, for my sister, Tiffany, and for myself, it was the loss of an immediate family member, a husband and a father. But for so many others, for his brothers and sisters, for his nieces and nephews, for his beloved grandchildren, both of blood and of spirit, for his friends and colleagues, and for the hundreds of students he taught over the years. It was a loss of a mentor, of a leader, the loss of a confidant and a conversationalist, the loss of a rock in their lives that had always been there, to listen, to bounce ideas off of, to be supportive, and to challenge us to be our better selves. In the days after my father's death, as the grief came in waves, losing him this way just seemed so incredibly unfair. However, in these moments of self-pity, I could clearly hear Steve's words in my mind, words he had said to my sister and I countless times over our lives. Whoever told you life was fair was lying to you. Ever the realist, my father. We're gathered here today to remember Steve Mockford, to celebrate a life well lived. Like any of us, my father had many facets, many sides to his nature, each of us only knowing the edges we were exposed to. Today you will hear from and meet other people dear to his life, others who knew Steve in ways personal to themselves. As we hear these people speak, we will all leave here with a more complete picture of the man we all knew and loved. I'd like to take this moment to invite anyone with a story to tell or a memory to share to please do so. Feel free to speak here today or to write your words in the memorial book. I'll get the ball rolling with a memory of my own. Most folks here today knew Steve as an academic, as a professor and a researcher. For the majority of my childhood, this was not the case. As a boy, my father was a soldier. Short hair, mustache, brash and tough, he served as a grunt in the Princess Patricia's Canadian Light Infantry. A proud member of Recce Platoon, he trained as a sniper, became a master sniper, excelled as a natural-born leader, and became a teacher within his ranks. When I was 8, he left his Army career to remuster in the Air Force to follow his passion as a photographer. From the click of the shutter to the final image being fixed, Steve had been obsessive about all things photography. I'll provide an example. When my sister and I were young children, weekends usually meant using the neighbor's bathroom, as ours was totally off limits. Dad having transformed the small room into a dark room, bathed in red light, complete with a stop clock, an enlarger, trays of chemicals, and drawing lines of fresh photos. His hobby took primacy over even the most basic bodily functions of his own flesh and blood. As I said, obsessive. However, knowing how to take and print pictures was not enough for Steve. He also had to know the why, the science and the history behind the photographic image. When I was 9, he brought me to work one day to share with me photography at its most basic level. Together we made a pinhole camera. Basically a box made light tight with duct tape with a small piece of unexposed film suspended within. A tiny pinhole in front of this box was kept covered with a thick black sheet of paper until you were ready to capture an image. The pinhole was exposed for a quick second before being covered over again. Watching the pictures we had taken that day slowly reveal themselves in their chemical baths, it seemed like a magic trick to me. No lens, no shutter, just this box with a pinhole in it. His enthusiasm and knowledge of the process had been infectious, nurturing in me not just an interest in photography, but in the scientific principles behind the process itself. This was my dad. It was not enough that he had learned all this interesting information. His true joy came from sharing these discoveries with others. Even decades before he would ever pursue a career in academics, he'd already been a natural-born teacher. Thanks, Dad. Before we continue, I'd like to take a moment to thank my mother, Lorraine, for this incredible day. This was her effort we enjoyed today as we remember Steve. I will quote my sister from one of the many text chains about today. You have done such an intentional job at every detail of Dad's celebration. So much love and consideration. Thank you. Thank you, Mom. Thank you so much for this gift you've given us all here today. I'd now like to invite Steve's brother, Don, to come and say a few words.
Thank you, Damien. Few people here today would have known my brother Steve as a child or youth. So I'd like to say a few words about the early part of his life growing up in Victoria. As the oldest of 5 kids, Steve was keenly aware that he would be our first role model, a responsibility he took quite seriously. He was our leader, always there to offer us advice and direction, always willing to spend time helping us with our studies. Even at an early age, he was respectful of our parents, our neighbors, and his teachers. Yeah, just kidding. Actually, when we were kids, Steve could be a bit of a dick. King of the gaunch pole, master of the noogie, he was the reason why we hid our piggy banks and our Halloween candy. In general, though, he was more mischievous than mean. I recall one Christmas when we were maybe 9 or 10, Steve got a wood burning set from our parents. And I remember thinking at the time, what could go wrong? Sure enough, a few weeks later, my dad calls me into my room and points to the floor behind the nightstand. There, permanently burned into the hardwood, were the initials DWM, my initials. Our dad, who was not in any way mischievous, could not fathom why in the world Steve would have burned my initials into my bedroom floor. So despite my claims of innocence, I ended up with the blame, while Steve ended up with a good chuckle. But it didn't really matter what pranks he pulled or what advantages he took, how mean or nice he could be. Steve was a magnet, and people were drawn to him. I was always impressed by his ability to connect and mix in with different types of people. The bad boys, the choir boys, the Boy Scouts, and the burnouts. He was usually fun to be around, and I was happy to have a front row seat to the Steve show. It was the early teen years that really began to shape the person that Steve would eventually become. He was a free spirit at a time when spirit wasn't always encouraged. He was irreverent. Comfortable in his own skin, he wasn't afraid to speak his mind to adults. Even as a young man, he was often one of the smartest people in a room. But he had a complicated relationship with structure and authority. These were the qualities that set Steve up for success in his role as a teenager in the 1960s. And the very same qualities that would set him up for failure in the education system of the day. I don't recall if he was invited to leave or if he just walked out, but Steve left school at an early age. High on youth and extreme inexperience, he decided, together with a buddy, to hitchhike across Canada. They almost made it, but got picked up by the police in Montreal. And because they were only 13 or 14, they were sent home, back to Victoria. Back then, Steve was all about learning by doing. So he learned from that experience. And the following year, they headed out again. And this time, they made it. Steve's resume only grew in the following years. Part-time, dead-end jobs, countless parties, maybe a joint or two. Lots of political discussions with other young people, passionate about the new ideas and politics of the day. A natural leader, leading himself in the wrong direction. Then, as seems to happen with intelligent people, Steve decided to change his luck. His first big stroke of luck came with a new girlfriend. I think he was about 16, she was maybe 14, pushing 15, and easily his intellectual equal. Lorraine was strong in areas where Steve had traditionally been weak. For instance, she could tell the difference between right and wrong. She was calm and mature. She made good decisions. She loved Steve, and Steve loved her. Less than 2 years later, his second stroke of life-changing luck, or maybe just good planning, newlyweds Steve and Lorraine welcomed Damien into their lives. Steve's story continues from here, a military career that honed his leadership skills and helped to develop his love and respect for his country. An academic career that would open his mind further, challenging him daily and allowing him the privilege of teaching. And at the heart of it all, his deep love of family. All these different components that helped to make Steve the good and interesting man he became. And all stories for others to share here today. Thank you.
I'd like to invite Dr. Tom Herman to come up to say a few words next.
Well, I couldn't help but think that how fitting it is that we find ourselves today on Turtle Island in the heart of the unceded and ancestral lands of the Mi'kmaq people on this very important National Day for Truth and Reconciliation. This was something that was not lost on Steve, the importance and the value of this and the contribution that the Mi'kmaq have made to the stewardship of these lands that we call home. It's a real honor to say a few words about Steve, but it's difficult to say just a few words. And I see, I notice Lorraine is sitting down now. So, where do I begin? Steve lived so many lives, and he touched so many lives. But most of us only interacted with a few of those, and a very small number of us were privileged to know all of those lives. But there were many dimensions to Steve, as you've already heard. Experiencing just one of them was enriching in itself. But there were these threads that throughout all of these lives, I'm quite convinced, were common. And those are humor, patience, kindness, determination, an exuberance for life, and a deep respect for humanity. I first met Steve, Steve to some, Dr. Mockford to those who experienced him in their first year biology classes, but they soon learned that that was not an appropriate moniker. And of course, last but not least, Big Guy. I first met Big Guy in 1991 as he was retiring from his first, well, not his first set of lives, but his most recent set of lives in the Canadian military, and to another set in the halls of Acadia and at Acadia, right here. And his insatiable curiosity, his wisdom were readily apparent. There was no question. And he became my first honors student with grandchildren, but no high school degree. So when we convinced the dean that it was appropriate to enroll and admit a student who hadn't graduated from high school, the rest is history, right? Of course, he went on, after he finished his honors degree, went on and did a PhD. I thought it was kind of fitting that after he did his PhD in population genetics at Dow, he came back to Acadia as a professor in the biology department, still with no high school diploma. And he taught in the biology department until he retired for a second time. Other people might want to speak about his colleagues here, and I'll let his colleagues speak about his collegial aspects. There were many. But as a mentor, I have to say, because of course the most heartening thing to a mentor is to be superseded by one of your mentees. So when I watched Steve as a mentor, it gave me enormous pleasure and joy. Because he really had few equals. He knew all of his students, whether they were in a first-year biology class of 200 or a graduate seminar of 6. He treated them all with the same respect. He was able to see the possibilities in those students and pull them out. It was quite remarkable. He would encourage people's enthusiasms. He spawned careers. He changed people's lives. Many of those lives are represented here today. He got a great deal of pleasure out of teaching, as we've already heard from Damien. It didn't matter what he was teaching, but as Damien said, his mentoring was, he was just always mentoring. It didn't matter. Certainly his major role as big guy was as to be the big mentor. And of course his grandchildren had a better grasp of doing science than most people with university degrees. Which was really quite remarkable. And Steve would come regularly with his grandson's latest definition of what it means to be a scientist, or what inquiry means, et cetera, et cetera. Now, there's another side of Steve, and of course that was as conservation biologist, and he had this unique way of mixing science and mixing curiosity and application. And of course, this was one of the things that made him particularly special. It was no accident that Steve was asked to be the first president of the Canadian Herpetological Society, which was a society of amphibian and reptile enthusiasts across Canada that was a blend of, or a marriage of two societies, one which was, that had both had been well established, one that was targeted on the science of herpetology and other on amphibian, the other on amphibian and reptile conservation. Of course, Steve was the perfect individual to be the first president of this joint society. I was just at the meeting of the CHS last week, and of course Steve came up in conversation repeatedly, and the entire society certainly felt a great loss and remarked on it all weekend during the meetings. His work on populations, genetic structure in Blanding's turtle, which might sound esoteric, actually changed both our understanding and the fundamental approach that we take to recovering this iconic species in Nova Scotia. And Steve's commitment to doing science in the name of community, in the service of community, was certainly epitomized by his service as long-term chair of the board of the Mersey-Tobiatic Research Institute, better known as MTRI. And this organization's quite phenomenal. It's become an honest broker in conservation conversations in southwest Nova Scotia, and for no small reason, or in no small way due to Steve's efforts in building that reputation. And of course, the province recognized those talents when they appointed him to the biodiversity strategy, the small task force that drafted that first biodiversity strategy. But Steve was also a citizen activist, as many of you know. He was no stranger to the political arena. But Steve saw environmental justice and social justice as two sides of the same coin, that they were inextricably linked. And he couldn't really deal with, he felt you couldn't really deal with one without dealing with the other. He was always very direct in his citizen activism. He presented the arguments, the evidence. He could be quite forceful, but he was always respectful. And even with those with whom he vehemently disagreed, he was always respected. Made him a rather memorable and worthy opponent. Damien remarked on his artistic abilities. I won't say much about that except to say that Steve was my Fujifilm go-to guy for all things both artistic and technological. which I really miss. I miss that connection. I'm struggling, but I'm getting through it. But seriously, he was a very gifted artist, and I think the things that he's left this enormous legacy of photographs that we can all enjoy for many, many years. But the thing to me that struck me about Steve's art was a couple of things. One is he had this incredible sense of light. He certainly had fabulous compositional skills, but his understanding of light and his ability to capture that was really quite remarkable. And of course, the other thing that he really captured was the deep connection between humans and the environment. And you can see that in almost every single one of his photographs. It's quite remarkable. Well, the one constant in all of Steve's many lives was, of course, his family. And the deep connection he had to family. Lorraine, love of his life for 50 years. His parents, his siblings, his son and daughters, and his grandchildren, always on his mind and in his heart, and always a subject of conversation. He was immensely proud of who they were, what they accomplished, and we're all graciously indebted to them for sharing him with us. I think, I'll just close by saying Steve had this understanding of our responsibilities to one another and to the planet, and better than most people. And I think, this was a life markedly too short, but remarkably well lived. And those final words, which are on the card today, to remind us all to do collective good. They were so, that was the culmination of Steve. What better way to leave the planet, and sage advice for all of us, and what better way to honor his memory than to do just that. So thank you very much.
Thank you, Tom. I'd like to next invite Dr. Soren Bondrup Nielsen to come up and say a few words.
In these occasions, my mouth dries out, so hopefully this will do. Anyway, it's a huge honor to be asked to say a few words about Steve, because Steve had an enormous presence and a huge reach, and I think that's very obvious today with all of you here, everyone having some connection to Steve. And I'm just going to mention a few stories about Steve. Tom just mentioned about when he came to Acadia. My first memory of Steve was in my probably second year of teaching here, maybe in 1990 or 91, I can't remember quite. But I was teaching, I had just begun teaching, and I'm sure I fumbled a lot. And in the front row of my terrestrial ecology class sat Steve, Eric, and Debbie Moreau, who is here. And it's only years later that Steve told me the reactions to my teaching method. I told the students, you don't need to take notes, just listen to what I have to say and take it in, and it'll stay there. So Steve and Eric, they put their pens down. They never wrote a thing for the whole term when I taught. And I think Debbie, wherever you are, over there, was quite frustrated because she said, what am I supposed to get out of this lecture? So something to that extent. Anyways, but it was wonderful to have Steve in the class because he clearly challenged me and would say, wait a minute, what do you mean by, whatever I was saying? And it was great because it was not confrontational. It was said in a way that I felt at ease and had to think about it and say, yeah, you're right, maybe I should have said it this way. And I think that was one of the characters of Steve, that he could be confrontational in a non-confrontational fashion, in a sense. And I think, I'm going to jump around a little bit, but right after his passing, on Facebook, there was one message that I read from Allison Walker, who is here, and it was how Steve would often end conversations in honors orals or defenses with some critique, but then say, but it's okay, which I think shows his ability to put people at ease, but to get them to think about things by just saying, but it's okay, don't worry about it. The second year, after the terrestrial ecology, Steve then took my conservation course. And again, he was a wonderful presence in the course. That year, I put on a panel debate on conservation, and we had a variety of people on it. One student had a relative from the United Nations, and that person happened to be there. So she was on the panel together with Glenn Bissix and, I forget the names anyway. But Steve was the moderator of the conference, of this setup. And again, he was totally calm and did a phenomenal job. And I was so impressed with Steve. One funny story is that in 2009, Steve was back at Acadia, and he was a prof in the department. And the Atlantic Provinces Political Science Association was having a meeting at Acadia. And Steve and I, we used to sit and talk all the time. We said, we should give a paper. We could give a paper at a political conference. So we got a paper together, and it was called something about ecological intelligence within the political arena. And yeah, you can imagine. So we thought, we'll give a paper like we used to do in sciences. But then we learned we had to write the paper. And whoever wrote a paper before giving it? So Steve and I contacted the organizers and said, wait a minute now, because the other thing was we had to write the paper, and then the moderator would read the paper, and then we had to answer questions. This was totally foreign to us. So Steve and I, we said, wait a minute, no. We will come and give a slideshow and just talk off the top of our head about it. And we got some interesting looks. But eventually they said, okay, your session can be conducted that way. And at the end, several people came up and said, man, that was much more interesting than having the moderator sit there and read the paper, and then the person who had written the paper would answer the questions. So that was our approach, and it worked. I was very fortunate to be head of biology when the position came up that Steve applied for. And it was such a no-brainer to hire Steve. And I remember still vividly going to his office and congratulating him that he got the position. And that was a huge honor to me, to be able to, shake his hand, and I gave him a hug and say, you got the job. So for several years in the new biology building, my office was just down one door or two doors from Steve. And I say daily, I would drop in and sit and talk to Steve, and it was such a pleasure to just sit and chat with Steve about just about any topic, because he was so broad in his ability to reach out and cover lots of topics. And once I retired, I dearly missed, dropping in on Steve and just sitting down and having a chat. The final thing I'm going to say about Steve is that in the old Patterson Hall, we had a very solid coffee culture. In the new building, biology building, that culture began to kind of slip away. And Steve was the one who really maintained it. He would come around and say, okay, time for coffee at 10 and at 3 or whatever it was. And so I dearly miss Steve. He was the kind of person, kind of friend that you expect always to be there. And in some sense, he is there, because I have to admit I still think about Steve quite often. And his kind of worldview, his way of being with people has certainly influenced me, because I often think about how Steve would act in a particular situation. Anyway, thank you so much.
Thank you, Soren. I'd next like to invite Sue Smiley to come up to say a few words. Thank you so much, Sue.
I met Steve on the very first day of mature student orientation here at Acadia. We exchanged nervous glances because we were both in our 30s and neither one of us had ever attended university before. We sat together and looked over the long list of electives. Steve said, "Do you want to take existential philosophy and mess with the minds of the 18-year-olds?" I said, yes, I do. And we did, and we did. I love Steve's sense of humor, his curiosity, his brilliant creative mind, but most of all, I loved how much he loved Lorraine and turtles, but mostly Lorraine. Steve's big love for Lorraine, his family, his colleagues, his friends, peers, and turtles is always present. As a grief therapist, big love equals big grief. As an atheist, I know the big guy, and his name is Steve.
Thank you so much, Sue. I'd next like to invite Jeff Franklin to come up to say a few words. Thank you, Jeff.
So, Steve and I met at a very similar point in our lives. Steve and I were both starting on what would be our last careers, our new careers in biology. I guess the year was 1991, but the numbers fail me. The memories don't. And so Steve was coming after, I think, maybe 17 years in the military and going into biology. And I was coming after a much shorter career in corporate accounting and going into biology. So we had something in common. We were both older, new experiences, and we ended up in the same 2 classes together. Marty Snyder's Intro to Genetics and Tom Herman's Intro to Ecology. And it took, because as you know, although I'm not, Steve was a strong character. And he had, he had big opinions, he had big ideas. And so for the first 2 weeks, we circled each other and didn't speak much, but then we began to talk. And we wore a groove to the south end of the sub, where we would go most days and debate. And possibly hundreds of hours of debate went on, when we probably should have been doing other things, but we were there. And that's when I learned about Steve. And when you think about Steve, Steve was strongly rooted. He had his family, he had his life in the military, and this is where he was from, and this is where he was going. I met him in genetics and in ecology, and of course, if you look at Steve's trajectory, that's where he went. Steve always knew where he came from, always knew who he was, and always knew where he was going. That's for sure. So as our time together would go on, I would found myself co-opting as many of his sayings as I could. Most I won't repeat here. But there are some that I've co-opted, and I've used them so many times that people have begun to think that they're my own. So I'm gonna come clean and at least put the record straight. So the first one, of course, that comes to mind: no atheists in the foxhole, and that was a central theme for many long debates over our beliefs and the frailty of our beliefs. And Steve had beliefs like all of us, and he understood the frailty of that feeling, to believe or not to believe. But another one that I really came to appreciate, and I use it all the time, and in fact, I think people in this room should use it from here on in, because we all know those days when you're trying to do something, you're trying to build something, and it's not going right. And there's a point of time where you need to walk away from this thing you're trying to do. So Steve would say, and I've learned to say, and I'm sure he got this from the Army, it's time to fall back 1,000 yards and call it an airstrike. And I've come to know that. I work in agricultural research, strongly impacted by climate. There are many days I have to fall back 1,000 yards and wait for the airstrike. But the other one, because Steve also he had a sense of humor. He didn't just like to debate with people. He liked to find their spots. So the other one was, he would always say, you know, I can tell you're lying because your lips are moving. And I don't think anyone's ever said that to me so directly as he did. And of course, I came to appreciate that. Yeah, okay. So in later years, we would continue on in a joint culinary club for 10 years. It was really just a thinly veiled guise for a debate club. And again, another couple hundred hours of debating the things that were important, politics and biology. And then we went through a period of time where, we all know how this goes, we didn't see each other. And the absences got longer. But a funny story, because Steve was here at Acadia at that time. I worked at the research station. He would have a good relationship with students, and some percentage of those students would find their way into my lab where I worked. And so invariably through the summer, you'd be with a student, you would talk, and we'd talk about people that we jointly knew, and Steve's name would come up. And I would always say, and I didn't do this maliciously, but definitely mischievously, so he used to be a sniper. And I don't think anybody ever believed me. They knew Steve for who he was. They didn't see that in him. But one student one day went back to Steve and said, there's this guy at the station who told us that you were a sniper. And so Steve said, yeah, but he used to be a corporate accountant, so you go back and tell him that. And as so many days, again, I lost the moral high ground to Steve, although I never mind losing to Steve. And yes, he was a kind person, and yes, he could concede a point, but he could hold on to a point too. And I will definitely never forget that. But also, on that day, not that long ago, that he called me and told me the news. And I was fortunate because those years with Steve was what I would call a durable friend. I didn't have to see him every day or every month. I just had to stay in contact. But it became obvious on that day when he called me, we're guys. We never talked about our friendship as a thing. Guys don't do that. But on that day, we did. And we both knew that something had gotten away from us, that something had gone by. And, I have so many happy thoughts of Steve, but there's a cautionary tale that everybody needs to remember here. Time goes by. Don't let it go. So I've got him laughing, I've got him crying. I guess it's almost the perfect audience. So the only thing I want to say at the end, my apologies if it sounds a little too out there, but on that week and those weeks after Steve passed, I couldn't help but think, where does an essence go? Because I, like Steve, had the same set of beliefs that Steve did. We were both pretty consummate atheists. But I know when I walk in this room today, the essence of Steve is still here. It's in every story and every person standing around this room. And I want to thank you for giving me the opportunity to stand here and be part of that essence. Thank you.
Thank you, Jeff. At this point, I'd like to open up. If anyone else would like to have something to say, they can feel free to come up to talk. If not, that's fine. Perfect. There's pound of cajou on the table. Everyone, please have some. Absolutely. Not at all.
I don't think I need a microphone. My name's Ian McLeod. I've been a friend of Steve Lorraine's for over 20 years, and you've all heard about Steve. I can't add anything to that other than my own personal experience with him, and only to say that we shared a couple of backgrounds in the multiple lives. We're both in the military. He took great pictures. I like looking at great pictures. And as everybody said, just having a conversation with Steve made you a better person. It made you smarter. It made you more aware. It made you more caring. And for me personally, one of the greatest things Steve has done for you, for me, and for everybody, is he got us through COVID with those daily pictures. It's the small things when we're all cooped up and couldn't see anybody. Every morning I look for those pictures that Steve posted, and there was a couple of mornings when he was late. That wasn't cool. But just to say, Lorraine, I'm a better person for having known him and for knowing you and your family. And, you know, to me, you'll always be a good guy.
Thank you so much, Ian. I'll take this moment to mention the wonderful work of the Mersey Tobiatic Research Institute in helping us put together the Steve Mockford Memorial Student Research Award, an award in Steve's honor to assist future aspiring post-secondary students in contributing or in continuing the excellent and necessary conservation work that the Institute does that was so important to my father. If you're interested in making a donation, you can go to the MTRI website and do so. I'll close out the speaking part of this event with a poem from Robbie Burns, epitaph from my own friend, from Heather Reed. An honest man here lies at rest, as ere God with his image blessed. The friend of man, the friend of truth, the friend of age and guide of youth. Few hearts like his with virtue warmed, few heads with knowledge so informed. If there's another world, he lives in bliss. If there is none, he made the best of this. Thank you all. Please enjoy mingling, speaking to each other. Thank you very much.